You get up here often, or are you in Washington most of the time?
Every so often, yes.
Yeah, right. And you guys have known each other for 20-odd years?
Oh, yeah.
All right.
A little over 21, 22 years.
Well, we got a couple of really interesting institutions to talk about, with them. And media analysis. Boy, if ever there's something that's really relevant, it's that. And the two tie together. Welcome very much to Conversations, where I'm pleased to welcome to the program two gentlemen who are concerned with the media and also with the accurate reporting within the media that might be improved upon from many people's perspective. And if I may, I'd like to introduce on the far left Mr. Lewis Wolf, who is generally in Washington but is here in New York, and we're very happy to welcome him to the program. He's one of the co-publishers of and founders of the journal Covert Action Quarterly. And Lewis Wolf, welcome very much to Conversations and to Manhattan Network.
Thank you.
And on my immediate left is an old friend, if I may say so, Bill or William Schaap, who is with the Institute for Media Analysis and is also one of the co-founders of the Covert Action Quarterly. And gentlemen, welcome very much to Conversations.
Thank you, Harold. Glad to be here.
Yeah, and I wonder, maybe you would, Bill, maybe you could share just from your own background. Covert Action Quarterly has won so many awards in terms of the censorship awards that are given, in terms of covering stories that are not followed by the normal or the established press, as it were. Or I wonder, maybe you could share, Covert Action Quarterly, when it got started, and then let's tie it in and loop it in, if we can, with the Institute for Media Analysis. But give us a little historical background, maybe of your two association and the establishment of this really important journal, Covert Action Quarterly.
Sure, I'd be happy to, Harold. In
Thanks.
fact, this month is our 20th anniversary of publishing Covert Action. It was originally called Covert Action Information Bulletin, and later the name was changed to Covert Action Quarterly, and we've been publishing steadily for 20 years, generally focusing on undercover operations, exposing the intelligence complex of the United States as it relates to foreign policy, and very often and very importantly how it relates to media misinformation and disinformation primarily. Lou and I and our third co-founder, Ellen Ray, met shortly before we started the magazine, when Lou was working with Philip Agee on a book that ultimately came out called
On the Run?
Called Dirty Work. No, On the Run was Phil's own book.
But I see. Oh, right.
Lou and Phil and myself and a few others and Ellen worked on two books, Dirty Work, the CIA in Western Europe, and then Dirty Work 2, the CIA in Africa.
I had done, as you know, I had done a program with Philip Agee some time ago. Maybe you could spell out who Philip Agee was, because he's a really interesting person.
He is indeed, and was a very brave person. He was really the first former employee of the CIA, a high-level case officer of the employee for 12 years or more, who saw the light, as it were, turned against the agency after he left it and decided to expose the inner workings of it. And his first book, Inside the Company, in 1976, I believe it came out, was the first time that any insider had detailed on a day-by-day basis the activities of a CIA station, what goes on in a foreign country through the station of the Central Intelligence Agency that's based in that particular country. We have them, the U.S. government has them in every country, but before that it was a very incredibly secretive operation. Very little was known about it. No former CIA officers had ever done a tell-all sort of a book, and Phil absolutely just told everything about everything and every operation he'd ever been involved in, every name of every person who'd ever been involved in. It was quite a shockwave around the world. The book came out all over.
Yes, indeed, and it was a very brave thing, particularly at that time, for him to take that kind of a stance.
Well, it was indeed.
Some very mightily arrayed forces.
Yeah, he ended up. In fact, there were many people who thought that he might get assassinated, and Phil's only explanation that it didn't happen is that if anything had happened to him, the whole world would have blamed the CIA for it. It would have been an accident, and nobody would have believed it was an accident.
Is there something to be said for that? We talk about whistleblowers, or people who actually do take that position, that very often the best, Lombardi used to say it, I think, the best defense is a firm and well thought out offense in terms of some of these things that do
well,
exist in the world?
I mean,
it might hearten, give a little heart to people.
Of course, there's a difference between a disgruntled employer and the Central Intelligence Agency.
Yes,
they can do a little bit more to you. And in fact, Phil did not escape unscathed. The CIA really vamped on him. They, through their contacts with the governments in Europe where he was staying, they caused him to be deported from England, they caused him to be deported from the Netherlands, they caused him to be deported from Italy, from 5 or 6 or 7 countries. For a while, he couldn't find any place to live. Ultimately, he settled in Germany and in Spain, and has had residency in Germany for many years. But they made it very, very difficult for him, difficult for his family, certainly difficult for him to do anything of any significance in sort of straight employment, but of course at that point he was not any longer interested in straight employment. What Phil said was that you, and I don't think he invented it, I don't know who said it first, he just said if you keep looking over your shoulder, you're going to trip over your own feet. You just have to go forward. And we did the same thing. We took, Lou and I and Ellen took a lot of heat when we first started Covert Action magazine. The CIA was not very well known then. Covert operations were not very well known then. Things have changed mightily in the last 20 years that I'm sure we'll talk about. But in those days, people didn't know very much about it.
Yeah, or didn't want to question, or do you think?
Well, a lot of people thought it was horribly unpatriotic to complain about the fact that, in our opinion, the U.S. government was doing the horribly unpatriotic things. We were interfering in the affairs of other countries all around the world. We were having foreign leaders and both in power and opposition leaders assassinated all around the world. We were doing pretty terrible things and causing untold suffering and millions upon millions of deaths. Not a handful, but you know, fomenting revolutions and counter-revolutions in which hundreds of thousands or millions of people would get killed.
Yeah.
And we thought the patriotic thing to do was to object to our government doing this. In the beginning, there were a lot of people who just thought it was unpatriotic to criticize anything the government did. It's a bit different now. Again, it's hard to realize now what it was like 20 years ago.
Right, or 20 years before that, in the time of McCarthy, it was even worse. In a certain sense, it got worse. But you had, you know, Arbenz, and you had Allende, and you had, you know, Mossadegh, and all kinds of things that were going on, and it was known. And you're still. Is it now becoming that the questioning of this, or whistleblowing, in the sense of whistleblowing upon the United States government foreign policy initiatives and so forth, in that larger sense, perhaps, than a company? Although some of these companies are walking with pretty big league boots in the world.
That's part of the changes
too.
In the 20 years, too.
But is it becoming, Phil, I mean, you're in Washington in a certain sense.
Yes.
Louis, is it becoming any easier in the sense that people are more ready to listen to some of these stories that are put in Covert Action Quarterly, or how do you sense your audience, as it were, and interest in the story, the kind of stories you produce? And I wonder if maybe you could talk a little bit about the Covert Action Quarterly, what kinds of stories you tend to have there, and how is it you've won so many awards from the Project Censorship competition, as it were, that's held each year?
Well, I would say, first of all, that many Americans have been spoon-fed a totally false history of our country and of our both foreign and domestic history and policy. And in regard to the CIA, it has been sold to the American people as an agency protecting the American people, protecting our country against foreign aggressors and foreign enemies. The reality, however, is that the CIA has engaged and continues to engage, I want to make clear, in a whole range of operations which we can discuss in some detail, which the human cost, the human factor here, and the human cost of these operations is what causes and creates more enemies for the United States than friends. And the legacy of the CIA around the world and also at home, because there is what they call in the trade blowback. And so the operations that are conducted and conceived out of Langley at the headquarters in Virginia tend to blow back. And so a lot of...
Blow back? What does it mean?
Well...
Backfire, or is that a...
No, they rebound to the United States.
Okay,
and so activities, for example, in the media field,
yes,
a false story which is planted in the London Sunday Times, for example,
which happens often,
very frequently, or in Mexico City, or in Pakistan, wherever it is, because of the electronic revolution, And because people are more and more aware, as you point out, these stories, these false and phony stories, blow back. And it's the same with the activities. After the Gulf War, you remember that people came home, the veterans came home with the Gulf War syndrome. This was not a CIA war. This was an operation conducted primarily by the Pentagon. And yet the CIA was intimately involved in the disinformation and the public relations which sold that war to the Gulf Operation Desert Storm before it even happened, sold it to the American people to accept it and to the Congress. Our magazine, I should say, has tried to document, has to really get the story out in its full and complete measure, and we don't leave it to innuendo or to rumor or anything like that. We document what we report, and we get the best writers we can find, both in the U.S. and around the world,
who are exposing these covert operations. And you bring up this idea of disinformation and the media-mediated manipulation of consciousness, which is so much a part of governance or governing. These days, we look at the campaigning for presidency, and it's a media campaign that is launched. And the media becomes more and more important, so there really is a connection between Covert Action Quarterly and the Institute for Media Analysis.
The government has always known of the importance of the media. I mean, people don't realize, but from the very beginning, a very, very substantial chunk of the intelligence budget, of the CIA budget, was devoted to media operations from the very beginning, because that is as important or more important than actual operations on the ground in making people think that the reason something happened are something other than the real reasons, making people think that certain events around the world mean other than they do, and most particularly making things which in fact were generated by the U.S. appear to be indigenous. I mean, one of the major aspects of a covert operation is that the U.S. involvement is supposed to be kept secret. So the U.S. has staged wars and revolutions and coups and overthrows all around the world, making it seem as if these were local internal matters of that particular country, when in fact the thing could have been created from the very, very beginning with U.S. people and U.S. money and U.S. support and U.S. weapons and U.S. uniforms and everything else. And you hire the local people to kill each other, but you've done everything, and there wouldn't have been a civil war, let's say, where it was, unless you had not, the U.S. intelligence community had not decided to create a civil war.
Yeah, and
this is the worst part of it, because many of these covert operations become disputes that never would have happened in the first place if the U.S. hadn't decided to do it. And that's separate from things that are more direct, like just swinging elections, having fraudulent elections, or else not fraudulent in one sense, but secretly giving millions and millions of dollars to one side in an election, which will then win because it overwhelms the opposition.
Yeah, it's interesting. They had a thing called the Institute for Democracy, or some sort of an organization that had a great deal of American funding to spread democracy and influence elections. And yet, if they were to say that there are people who are going to influence elections here in the United States, that's some sort of a horrendous something that cannot be allowed to happen. The Chinese charge that the Chinese are putting money into the campaign financing system here in the United States. But they had this organization, and
the National Endowment for Democracy.
Yeah,
is called.
right, that sort of a thing. And it's just taken as that's
the most misnamed organization other than the CIA itself.
I mean, that's something you would call people's attention to the reality of.
Sure,
right?
but one of the problems is that because the level of hypocrisy is so high that you can cut it with a shovel, and you would think people understand, but the American public, to a large extent, have become inured to a lot of this over the years, because it's just, I mean, the thing about it in the elections, people think it is absolutely horrible that, say, the Chinese would donate some money to some congressman's campaign.
And they do.
But the U.S. has been donating money, donating being a loose word, to campaigns for 50 years.
Right.
All over the world, in some cases huge amounts. I mean, we're talking, tens of millions of dollars and hundreds of millions of dollars. And in some cases of recent years, not even secretly. And yet, the government can take the position that it's not wrong for the National Endowment for Democracy to pump you know, millions of dollars into elections in Russia or Ukraine or whatever, but it would be the greatest sin in the world if some Chinese businessman gave money to a candidate.
Is it sort of hubris or arrogance on our part that we think that we have the right institutions that are to be put upon, I don't know, some people say Pax Romana, or, you know,
Pax
sort of
Americana.
that we have a Pax Americana, that we have the institutions that are going to influence the whole world, and the sooner people can become aware of those structural adjustment, other kinds of things that we could impose on the world, let them just get with it, and they ought to get with it, and we're going to do that rather than sending
let's hope that someday it is referred to as hubris. At the moment,
right.
It's accepted as sort of the God-given right of the American government to tell everybody else in the world what's best for them. And it's become accepted. I mean, this country goes crazy if some other country tries to tell us what we should do or what position we should take on some issue. And that's
right, they've got no right to interfere.
And yet,
right.
we not only do we tell other countries how they should handle their internal affairs, we tell them if they don't do it, we're going to bomb the bejesus out of them,
right.
and occasionally do that.
And we also can intimidate them with the Bretton Woods organizations, which are in Washington. Interesting, not even in New York, but they're in New York, and they're supposed to be an international agency, but it's really a projection of American power, isn't it not?
If the U.S. can't control an international agency, they don't generally belong to it, or else they quit. They quit UNESCO when they couldn't control that, and then came back when they could control it. And it's just the U.S. government gives lip service to international law at best. I mean, we just simply do not accept anything that can tell the United States what to do because of this notion that we have the God-given right to tell everybody else in the world what to do.
That's not just an outgrowth of realpolitik and the thinking that sovereignty resides at the national level and there's no more, you know, Hans Morgenthau used to say there's no morality in international relations, that kind of thing? Or are we getting beyond that to where some of the international law criminal court that's trying to be established now and so forth might begun to be appropriate to a world that's becoming globalized and so forth?
I was talking more about the hypocrisy in it, because we accepted international participation in the Nuremberg trials.
That's right.
And gave lip service to internationally united action, but that was only because we knew that was going to come out the way we want it to be. Right. And whenever we do know it's going to come out the way we want it to be, then we say we support that type of international action.
But then we hired.
Yeah, go ahead.
Excuse me. Let me just say that after Nuremberg, within a matter of weeks, we were hiring a number of the war criminals, the world-class war criminals who were not executed. And they came to work for the U.S. government, for the CIA, for the U.S. Information Agency, and other agencies, the Atomic Energy Commission, and others.
Yeah. So we were in that kind of way. It's not an outgrowth of the maybe it'd be fair to go back. I mean, because we do have this idea of realpolitik. We do have a world that's becoming more and more globalized. There are some companies that will be able to operate in a global pattern where they will, in a certain sense, bypass, as they can, sovereign government entities and so forth. You will do what we tell you, and it's coming to be where the privatization in the public in the private sector is becoming more and more important. But I wonder if we could back up. The CIA, as an agency for gathering intelligence and working in international sphere, grew out of the OSS in the Second World War. The intelligence activities, Donovan and those kind of people. I knew people that were serving in the OSS proudly and well in terms of fighting the Nazi and that sort of thing. And then it somehow got off track, or did it grow out of that? And does the CIA, an entity like the CIA, exist with all sovereign countries? Are we just, let's say in a certain sense, condemning the United States for what is actually an international practice? And we have the Mossad, we have other kinds of agencies around the world that have this, they had the capability in the Soviet Union and that kind of thing, or not? I wonder if you could put it in a perspective for
Well, OSS, of course, the Office of Strategic Services, was, in its time, really a small-time organization. It was a few hundred men, mostly some women, very few. And their job, as they did it, was harassment, was covert activities, paramilitary activities. But in my view, and the view of a number of scholars who've written on OSS, it was quite ineffectual, not only against the Germans, but also in Asia, in the arena against the Japanese, and in Manchuria. I think that many of the people who joined the CIA in 1947, 2 years after the OSS was disbanded, were shall we say, somewhat idealistic. But that idealism that they had during OSS days very, very quickly dissipated, and they became very hard-nosed, very believers in America rules the world.
How did it get to be from where it was a noble agency to where it became one that was doing things that could be seen in a certain interpretation as ignoble?
I don't think it was ever a noble agency. There may have been people in the beginning who had some noble intentions, but what happened was almost from the very beginning.
I'm talking OSS and...
No, not OSS. I'm talking about from the beginning. The OSS's mission was to fight the Nazis, which was a noble enough mission under the circumstances of World War II. Nobody... There wasn't any sort of pro-Nazi side having an argument about this. The problem is that even before the last days of World War II, the mission of the U.S. intelligence agencies was already clearly to fight communism rather than the Nazis. And this decision was made even before the World War II was over. But it was more than that, because what it really was the global competition. And once you set up a secret agency which is at the bidding of the president very quickly discovers that he has this like amazing toy in his hands. Toy's a bad word because they kill, as I said, millions and millions of people. But all of a sudden, sure, in Indonesia, in the revolution in Indonesia, which the CIA played a major role in fomenting, millions of people were killed. There have been millions is not an overstatement.
That's what I'm saying.
There's no question about that. But it's more than just the casualties in the overt wars. There's generally, because the mission is to support the American commercial apparatus and multinational corporations and so on, you will end up having the CIA as an instrument keeping oligopolies in power in almost every country where they operate. And what that will generally mean is that the majority of the people, sometimes the vast majority of the people in those countries, live in misery, so that the companies and organizations that support the government that we keep in power can do well. So while the CIA's mission in that country might not be to make the lives of 90% of the people miserable, what they do will have the effect of making the lives of 90% of the people miserable.
And the thing that needs to be very clear here is that the CIA around the world since the early 50s has created in country after country after country, and we can list them if you want, the agencies of repression in Iran, in Indonesia, in the Philippines, in Taiwan, in Malaysia, in Guatemala, in Brazil. I mean, the list is endless. And I think people should understand that in order to enforce the system that the CIA and the U.S. government seeks to impose, they need to have an apparatus on the ground, up and running, which is just as ruthless as it can be. Let me just say that one of the founding documents of the CIA in 1947 actually used the word that we need to be ruthless. That was in fighting what they referred to as fighting communism. Of course, in the name of anti-communism, so much was done. Right.
It has been, and that's been the situation. I asked you before, the idea that the CIA is something relating to American interests, and the United States strides the world with big league boots these days, and they're very superpower, remaining superpower, fall of the Soviet Union. But is the CIA, or something comparable to the CIA, characteristic of, to the degree they can muster it, is characteristic of all the governments of the world, or is there something particularly nefarious, if that's the right term, about the operations of our CIA as compared to other intelligence agencies around the world, or where does it fit in? Is there an international intelligence community, and how do they fit together? I mean, and how does it? And do you look at some of the others other than the CIA in terms of these covert activities?
I mean, virtually every country has an intelligence division of some sort. But in smaller, less powerful countries, it's normally limited to more traditional notions of gathering intelligence or trying to keep tabs on things or keep its government informed, or occasionally it will be linked to domestic repression of a sort. I mean, some of these intelligence agencies have very little to do with international affairs, but are mostly there as some branch of their government to deal with the opposition. But in order to interfere in the affairs of other countries to the level to which the CIA does, you have to be a major power. And the fact is that all the major powers have these institutions, and all of them do interfere in each other's affairs and the affairs of the hapless little countries that get interfered with by everybody. But there's a qualitative difference, we think, between the way in which the CIA did this and the way in which almost all the other major intelligence agencies, even including the KGB, did this. The KGB was never responsible for the deaths of millions upon millions of people in foreign countries the way the United States was in places like Indonesia. They have spies all over the place, and they're always, I mean, every country wants the policies of other countries to be favorable to it. The United States would like France or Britain or Germany or would like their foreign policy to be what we want it to be, and every country wants that about everybody else.
Right. This sort of like
but what the U.S. does in order to manipulate those policies in other countries is, like Lou said, is much more ruthless than anybody else in current times or modern times. And there have been, I mean, the Soviets, the French, the German, the British, they all have done some ruthless things in their time, but nobody made such a steady and hugely financed policy of massive intervention as the U.S. did. It's changing now because they're using public organizations and quasi-public organizations and multinational corporations in ways that they never did openly before. In the old days, the multinational corporations would provide cover for the CIA to do some of its things. Now they do it.
Now the multinational corporations will do it. They'll have a branch that will do
well, because it's much more easy to interfere in other there are foundations which will probably not remain nameless, but there are foundations groups that give millions of dollars to a political party in an upcoming election in some country in Eastern Europe. Now, in the old days, the CIA had to do that secretly. You had to set up little organizations in Liechtenstein and here and there and funnel your money to them so they could get it, and people would sneak across the border and give the money to the opposition. Now you don't have to do that. Now some American foundation will publicly open offices in the capital of this little country and give boodles of money to the people that the U.S. government and, coincidentally, this foundation want to win, and some of them are related to multinational corporations. Some are not. There are certainly, you can see among the major multinationals which countries would have an obvious interest in this country being pro this or anti that. The country where you do a lot of your manufacturing, you want to have very weak labor laws. But you'd be perfectly happy if the company where your competitor is based has very tough labor laws. And you can try and manipulate that.
So the whole thing has become, what used to be covert, or I wonder, maybe pretty soon there won't be any more covert actions. It'll all be overt actions that'll be taking place on a world international scale as things begin to globalize, and things take place in the open, as it were, that would have been horrendously illegal or immoral or unethical in the context of we saw things in the past, but it's now becoming to where it's just being openly done on a world scale. Is it a case that the United States particularly comes into your focus, CIA and that sort of thing, because we are particularly successful at a game that all the world is trying to play? So is it in a certain sense trying to take a pot shot on your parts at something comparable to Microsoft is very successful in the software industry? The United States is very successful. It's being very successful, and you just don't want to, you don't want to allow the success that they've been able to generate on a world scale, and that's what politics and geopolitics is all about, and America's doing real well.
You're being a devil's advocate, Harold. I know that.
I just thought I'd throw it out.
Their success stories are far outweighed and outnumbered by their failures. But their successes are measured by them, by the CIA, in body count, like the Pentagon. In the numbers of people that are killed, the numbers of elections that they can manipulate, the numbers of newspapers that they can control, and that's, to me, the most devastating statistic of all. That is the human cost of their operations. Needless to say, their failures, as they call them, and they rarely talk about their failures, but the public knows more and more what they are. The failure, for example, to predict, even to know about the fall of the Soviet Union.
Wasn't it amazing?
It was an amazing case.
They missed the biggest story that was coming, and they just
of
didn't have it with all their
century.
intelligence capability. It makes you wonder.
And there are numerous other failures you could point to. The Shah of Iran, they defended him to the last week of his rule there, and suddenly they were calling him a megalomaniac. I'm sure your viewers remember Jean Kirkpatrick, who wrote a book saying that Anastasio Somoza in Nicaragua was a dictator, but he was our dictator. He was our friend. And Papa Doc Duvalier was the closest friend we had for many, many years, and Baby Doc then in Haiti, and Suharto until last month in Indonesia. And you could go down the list. You know, for the years that they held power with the iron grip, underwritten by and supported actively by the U.S., in particular the CIA, but also the State Department and other arms of the government, they were the best thing since sliced bread as far as the U.S. government perceived it. And then suddenly, when they can't hold power anymore, when the public, in the mass of the public in those countries, in country after country, cannot take it anymore and rises up and just throws them out, suddenly now we call them dictators. Isn't it amazing?
Yeah, that does.
Unfortunately, American people, have very, very short political memories for things like this, and not only do they not hold the government to account for these quick flip-flops, they don't even hold the media to account, because and the problem is it's a lot of hard work to do it, but even if you take the case of Suharto, if you looked on the front pages of the New York Times or the Washington Post for 30 years, year after year after year, they would talk about President Suharto, this President Suharto. The word dictator would never, ever appear. 2 months before he's going to fall, the New York Times will start saying, President Suharto, who some people refer to as a dictator, blah, blah. Another week or two later, they're going to say, President Suharto, the apparent dictator of, and 2 weeks after that, they're going to say Dictator Suharto, and then the next day he's gone, and the Times will say, see, we told you all along he was a dictator. Well, for 29 3/4 years, they talked about him like he was a great guy. And nobody remembers and nobody says, holds them, and that happens time after time after time, and sometimes it's very, very, we learn from some discussions and debates with people in major newspapers, and particularly the Times, that they have, the establishment press has formulaic ways of saying these things, and in the modern age of computer, which is so much easier than the old blue pencil day, a reporter cannot get away with it. I mean, for example, for 10 years at least, long after the overthrow of Allende, and even to the point where Pinochet's power was diminishing, the New York Times always referred to the Marxist Salvador Allende.
Trippingly off the tongue.
And if a reporter had a sentence which said Salvador Allende, the computer threw the Marxist in front of Salvador Allende, because that was. And this is not a joke. This was, I mean, I know it sounds funny.
I know it does, doesn't it?
But the thing is, when you look at it and you see that 850 times out of 850, it said the Marxist Salvador Allende, it's not coincidence. It always said, for example, and to this day I think still does, they may have changed it a little bit, but at least as of a few years ago, they always referred to the past history as the Allende regime, and they always referred to the Pinochet government. And if you said the Allende government, the computer took out the word government and threw in the word regime, because they had decided. Now, the ironic thing is that Allende was elected and Pinochet wasn't. And yet, because regime in this country, in American English, has a bad connotation to it, the decision was made to refer to Allende's government as a regime and refer to Pinochet as a government. And you just couldn't do it otherwise, because your copy had to go through the computer before it got typeset, and those words would. And
that's becoming even more so now. We've become more and more into the computer age with all kinds of.
People don't realize the extent to which the little words that are in the news and the way, whether it's Dan Rather reading off a script or something on the front page of the Times or whatever it is, and CNN and public radio and television are not immune to this either. It creeps in. The words are very, very important in building internal almost subconscious notions of things. I mean, if you hear of a thing, of a government referred to as a regime, and never referred to as anything else but a regime, you begin to think it probably took power in some bloody coup and it's a repressive Nazi whatever, and you never realize that the only reason you think that is because they decided to call it that.
Yeah, right.
I don't remember.
You can minimize a group or a people or a country or an agency just by, well, so-called is the best one. I mean, the New York Times used to refer to the so-called non-aligned movement, which was sort of bizarre. This was an international organization. Its name was the non-aligned. They never said the so-called North Atlantic Treaty. They never said the so-called United Nations. But they said the so-called non-aligned movement, even though that was its official name, because so-called sort of makes it, you know, a little less palatable.
Well, this is all part in that thing they call spin, or they put an interpretation on it, or dissimulation, or disinformation is now openly that way, and that's so much a part of in the media now, and that's why we were talking here. We were talking about covert action, but I mean also this idea of the Institute for Media Analysis. That's very important to try and understand the media because it is influencing consciousness and influencing and allowing for people to internalize certain kinds of values, and has a political connotation, the media, that and power that it has not had historically, and to analyze that and to understand it is really of the essence in terms of trying to understand public policy, don't you think?
As you were just speaking, Bill, I was trying to remember the last time I read in any print media the word regime after whether it was Nixon, Bush, Reagan, Clinton. I never saw that.
You don't even, they're so together. You don't even see it in the Democratic description.
And yet there are many people in this country who certainly perceive successive governments, successive administrations as regimes in terms of how they operate and function.
The words are astonishing. I mean, the thing is that the government directly and indirectly through the establishment press have been spinning the news for centuries, I suppose, probably forever. I mean, to a certain extent, the ancient governments tried to do the same thing. I mean, you know, I mean, the victors carved the monuments and put the inscriptions on them.
And wrote the history by and large.
Exactly. That's what I mean. So it would, you know, it would say who was great, but it's become so pervasive now that the media, an awful lot of it has become self-propelled and through self-censorship more than anything else. I mean, the CIA doesn't need, although they have them all over the place, it doesn't need an actual employed case officer or agent inside the newsroom of every major publication around the world. Now, mind you, it still has them in a lot of places, but it doesn't need it as much now because if it can manipulate the government thinking and that's relation to the corporate thinking, the publishers of the establishment press are going to say what they want them to say. Now, they have the fallback. They've got those computers that'll take out the bad words, but they almost don't have to, the computers don't have to do that very much. I mean, it's not, I mean, the other thing is that it shouldn't be that surprising. People in this country will use an expression like the establishment press or the establishment media without stopping to think what that means. I mean, if they said the communist press, they know that means the press that takes the view of the Communist Party. If they said the Social Democrat press or the Christian Democrat press, and people in Europe know, because in Europe they're much more honest about it. You'll go to a newsstand, there's 6 papers, everybody knows that's the Communist paper, that's the Christian Democrat paper, that's the Social Democrat paper, that's the whatever paper, and you know that. But in this country you think they're all very objective, except for the fact that they're the establishment press, which means they're the paper that represent and promote and push and insist on the view of the establishment.
Well, all right, then what if they say that the establishment is a very big umbrella, a very big tent, and there's all kinds of thought and belief and so forth that fits under this big umbrella of democracy and so forth, and that there's room for all kinds of things.
Runs the gamut from A to B, as well we know. I mean, you know, when they have to get rid of Nixon, they'll get rid of Nixon. But it was the establishment that got rid of Nixon, not the anti-establishment.
There's an institution right now run out of the U.S. Information Agency. It's a sort of a newfangled version of what Bill is talking about, and it's called WorldNet, where they have completely, I think, stage-managed press conferences. They call them press conferences, where Madeleine Albright, for example, and other officials will sit in a studio, and she will take questions from journalists in particular countries, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And they're all, it's real, it's
Right,
live,
yeah, like
okay?
a-
It happens
yeah.
live.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that the people who are allowed to ask those questions are handpicked.
Mm-hmm.
They're people, and anyone who they know is going to ask the wrong question, and they have to submit questions in writing before they come in to ask them.
Mm-hmm.
The whole thing is completely fraudulent,
Mhm.
and yet this is how part of the whole media manipulation that we conduct. It's only a small part, but it's pretty blatant, I
we
think.
want to talk about media analysis. And would they say that for a reporter or something, that the thing that they're going to filter out are reporters who come in who simply are not informed? They do not understand the nuances of the language. They do not understand the nuances of the policy. They're not well enough informed. They're likely to ask just, well, naive questions. They just don't understand the realities. And they want people who really do understand so that they won't lose time with a lot of, you know, the riffraff asking naive questions from alternative views, rather than it being some sort of a thing that's going to seriously question the way the system works. They just don't want people who aren't informed, so they want those qualified people to be having internalized and actually learned the realities of the way in which this world works, so that we can get real news reporting out there and they waste our time with, you know.
Well, that's what they'll
Populist
say. I
nonsense.
mean, now that you've said it for
Yeah,
them, they'll
right.
probably take that down
Right,
and use
yeah,
it next
right.
time. But we know perfectly well that what they do is exclude people who are going to ask questions they don't want to be asked.
All right.
And it has nothing to do with how, in fact, most of the people they're excluding are probably considerably more well-informed than the people they include. Because the people they include have simply been able to write, I mean, you don't have to know that much to know what kind of a question the official would like to get asked. But you do have to know something to know what kind of a question the official would not like to get asked.
And the people in the media will, and very often it might be in a certain sense, if you were to sit down and have dinner or something with them, they will have just self-censored in a certain sense or internalized those values in their psychological makeup. They're not doing it perhaps in a way that is nefarious in their own, or you know, some sort of a thing like, they just internalize those values and then they begin to be recognized
most of
and
them,
get rewards.
Most of them,
systems.
these major people, are not part of some monstrous overt conspiracy where they sit down and say, well, we're not going to talk about that strike in that city because this big corporation doesn't really want that to be talked about. They sort of know in general that you know, it is not the working people of the country that own their corporation.
That's
it's
right.
the bosses and the you know, and the big.
And that's
that
just the way it
happens.
is. Yeah.
I mean, sometimes it's more direct
Yeah.
because in this country in particular, it's happening all around the world, almost all major media organizations are no longer independent companies. They are now small parts of giant conglomerates whose major business is no longer the news.
Right.
Every major network and most major newspapers are owned by companies
entertainment
whose major industry is not that. Well, no, General Electric is not a, you know,
Well,
they make,
lots
you
of
know,
other things,
but
war
the
weapons,
TV station is a small part of it.
Yeah.
Even the New York Times company has more other businesses than the newspaper.
Really? Yeah.
By
okay.
far.
Yeah.
They're one of the biggest paper manufacturing
Yes.
companies in the world, and wood pulp and that kind of
Right,
stuff.
right,
And the Times itself is a small part of it. Every single major media operation is now being run by people who are businessmen with stockholders and a bottom line, and not a company whose main business is news.
And
so they will end up having, you know, people working for them who understand that. They will also have people working for them who realize that you do not bite the hand that feeds you. None of these major corporations ever, unless it happens by accident and then people with the axe will fall, ever run stories exposing some other branch of that multinational.
Much less exposing the media themselves. You casted light upon the media analysis, the analysis of the media, and there are institutions that do that. Not enough. Jeff Cohen does with FAIR and some other people do.
Yeah.
And they try and look at that sort of thing, but they do. And you have these people, these large corporations. Ben Bagdikian has, perhaps better than anyone, has, you know, has documented the degree to which the consolidation down into a few media companies controlling 85% of what goes before the eyeballs and ears of the people of this country is by fewer, smaller companies, and you've got so many people within those companies that are not even, don't even have the patina of a journalistic objectivity or something like Ed Murrow or something like that, but they're just simply businessmen making business decisions.
And then at the same time
they
you
think
have
the invisible hand of business stock values is going to best let the world run on automatic pilot or something. I don't know. They actually believe that.
Then you have the example, and I'm trying to remember his name, Pete Williams, who was the Pentagon spokesman, who crosses the street. One day he's at the Pentagon, his last day, Next day he's at was it NBC, where
Yeah.
he's now a correspondent.
Yeah, all right.
This
yeah.
is really dirty stuff.
So you have a combination of both the government and the press. The press had been in one thing. I don't know, Mencken, whoever said it, that you're to afflict the comfortable and bring comfort to the afflicted. That kind of a journalistic kind of charge is being lost by the media. Do you think the media? We're going to talk about media analysis. What do you see about media analysis? And we do want to touch. We want to take a minute or two to look at television media and also the internet that's emerging as a miraculous new kind of development that's coming on the scene. But we are here, after all, in public access cable television, which in a certain sense is supposedly and theoretically, in a sense, divorced from the commoditization process of information and is set aside for the folks in a way. And whether or not we think that's an important thing,
it divorces
or
you
where
from the networks and the
well, okay, but anyway, you do see this as a problem in terms of the voices of alternative voices being able to find a way into the public consciousness.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Okay. It's gotten to be so expensive a business to, putting aside the internet for a moment, but to reach the kinds of audiences that need to be reached. We will, that the alternative media can't really compete on the same level with the networks and the major national and local newspapers at all. It's almost insurmountable. It's not insurmountable when the problem really is glaring. It's more surmountable when you're dealing with national and local issues than international issues, because international issues, it's very hard to convince people what's really happening in some country 10,000 miles away if the networks and the papers are saying something to the country. It's much harder for the establishment to fool people about what's happening on Main Street, because there's a limit to how much you can lie in a newspaper that something that happened in the middle of town and everybody saw it and said, no, that's not true, that's not what happened.
Right.
You can describe a demonstration in Istanbul, and you can say whatever you want. Nobody who reads the paper here is going to know whether you're telling the truth or not. Many will unfortunately assume you are. Yeah. But you couldn't really describe a major thing happening in the middle of New York City or Washington too inaccurately.
Without people having some smart.
You couldn't say a handful of people came to protest the Vietnam War
when there were 10,000.
A million people came,
right.
So they can do better on fooling people on foreign policy than on domestic. But I don't know what the answer other than encouraging the alternate media, encouraging things like public access and alternative magazines and so on.
Like and the Institute for Media Analysis, if I may. That's a very important
institution.
Yes,
we try to, but again, we don't purport to be able to, even when we publish books and monographs and pamphlets and stuff, there's no way we can compete with the establishment publications to the contrary.
You can, and you're able, and with others, you can put a spotlight on that, and you can spotlight some of these other egregious things. This Project Censorship that they do at Sonoma
once in a while we nail them.
Yeah,
too.
right, all right, that's good and everything. But I'm wondering, that big tent, that idea we have a big tent where under the word rubric establishment, that it can hold a wide variety of thought and a wide variety of philosophy. And in fact, some people think there's not a dime's difference between the Republican and the Democrats now, and that kind of thing and so forth. But is it possible within that large tent that perhaps they will at a certain point come to with the downsizing, with the globalization, with the negative effects that so many people are feeling? Some people feel there's a certain degree, despite the Wall Street setting records and the employment levels and so forth being high and the economy is being well and everything. But there are a lot of people who have at a certain sense, a sense of there's expert systems, other kinds of things, perhaps displacement of labor problems, that there's a level of angst that's abroad in the society, and that if within that broad tent someone could find a philosophy, let's say a political philosophy which would bring let's just say a human face to capitalism or something of that sort, that would be able to bring an alternative system, that the competitive forces within this establishment would be able to find itself if they could but find a reasonable alternative voice to the way things are going to be operated domestically and internationally. But they haven't yet quite found that voice within the tent, which we call the establishment. If they did, there could be competitive forces who would go with that politically or not. Or do you think that that's a dead issue, that we cannot find answers within the broad array of the established notions of accepted wisdom and that sort of thing?
I don't think the tent is, they won't allow people in the tent who, either people or ideas into the tent which are different than the status quo.
What is the-
Yeah, I don't
What
think,
is
I don't
the-
think
what
most
is
of
the-
us are in that tent.
What
We
is
talk
the,
about
all
the
right,
big
what
tent.
is it, when we talk about the establishment of the alternative, what is the defining characteristic of the alternative, and what is the institution or the basic institution that is to be safeguarded under the rubric establishment, and what is the holy grail that is so assiduously being protected?
Oh, the vast majority of the wealth of the nation. I mean, it's
So
you know,
it's the
very
ownership of
small,
the-
a very
2%.
small percentage of the people of this country own a very large percent of everything.
Oh yes,
and they want to keep
5%
it.
virtually owns
Look
it
at the
all.
media's
Yeah.
reportage on Bill Gates for the entire year. I mean, just as one example, and
Yeah.
on Microsoft, and now, of course, the Justice Department is pursuing legal avenues against Microsoft.
Yeah.
The fact is, until Forbes magazine, of all people, comes out with their list, their annual list,
Yeah.
and this week showing that Bill Gates' income in 1997 is $51 billion.
Yeah.
It's
Pretty
totally
penny.
obscene.
Yeah.
He's made $15 billion more this year than last year.
Yeah.
The point is, the media, the mainstream media, doesn't touch the obscenity of a Bill Gates having that kind of money,
Uh-huh.
to say nothing of the fact that he doesn't.
So this would be
you-
this would be the sine qua non or something of trying to find some sort of a thing. You know, there's lots of different kinds of things you could find and so forth. You know, but there would be the concentration of the ownership of the means
Oh,
of production
absolutely. I
is
mean-
the question that is to be. Suppose they were to come up with some sort of a system to democratize that.
Well, see, the problem
And
is
to
you use
legitimately democratize the ownership of the technological aspects or the capital assets, let's say, and they really
well,
did.
maybe
They
you
came
can,
up
but
with
I wouldn't
something
call. You
like
used
that.
the expression before, Harold, about capitalism with the human face, and
Yes.
then you used the
Is it
expression
possible? Or
another
is it-
system.
is it-
And
is
what I was going
it-
to say is, first of all, capitalism with a human face is not another system.
Uh-huh.
Capitalism, whatever mask you put on it,
Uh-huh.
and I think it's probably inherent in that system that you can't have the kind of economic democracy that we're talking about, because, I mean, I don't want to get into, I mean, I'm not an economist and I don't know all the terminology right, but basically if people are making a profit off the labors of others, the others are losing something that those people are making. They're not sharing it. The boss
that's-
and the worker don't sit down and share
Right.
the profit. And I don't know, this is, you know, this, it's maybe it can take tens or hundreds or thousands of years to evolve something remotely idyllic, if we haven't blown the world to bits before that happens. But in the short term, at least, the difficulty is fighting these myths that democratic capitalism is the system we have in this country is like wonderful for everybody.
But we don't
it's
have
not
dem-
wonderful.
No,
for
but you
everybody.
could bring up the story. We don't have that story in itself could be we don't have democratic capitalism. We have economic plutocracy. This is a plutocratic system we live in.
Oh, sure,
And most
but-
people are beholden to economic interests in order to keep them in line within a system that is not
But I was
liberating
saying
of the human
they
spirit.
call it, but I was saying you kiddos, I'm not sure that democracy in the very full sense that you mean it and capitalism are consistent or compatible. I don't know that you can have it. I
Well-
mean, there are certain inherently undemocratic things in capitalism, which is that somebody's going to be making money and somebody's going to be losing it.
Well, all right, maybe I don't know, maybe, but
There
we live in
are-
strange and wondrous times.
I mean,
in a
if
certain
you could
sense.
have a country where creating rich people did not require creating poor people,
Right.
that would be terrific. But I
Well-
haven't seen that yet.
Well, no, but I mean, I wonder. I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, because you assume zero sum in your analysis there, that for one to win, another has to lose. Bucky Fuller used to go around, and now you got strange
No.
people going around. Bucky Fuller used to say that through the technological capability, extension of our capability, we were growing through time. 200,000
I know, but
years.
we're not
and
only are we not
crossed the
growing
line-
equally, but
Let me
it's getting
finish.
worse.
Yeah, but no, but in the surface, but at another level, he said that the technological capability was creating an abstract capability where we had the ability, which we hadn't had historically, that we crossed the line from where there were more in the abstract capability, more haves than have-nots in terms of our technologically augmented capability of providing life support. He said we crossed that line 1970.
Oh, that there could be,
is
you
going,
mean. Not that there are, but that there could be.
No, but historically, the abstract capability was not there. We could have said in the
Right.
10th century, everybody's,
Right.
you know, we can have
If
winners
there
of
wasn't
everyone.
yeah,
but
if there
we
wasn't enough
crossed the line-
food for not to have some hungry people, there wasn't enough food. But the problem is that I agree completely
But we
that
crossed that line
that
at a
line.
certain level.
Yes, but there's
That's a big story.
No, but the
We
problem
crossed
is
the line of scarcity and it's not brought up. Why
the
isn't
problem
it
is
developed?
there's no way you can get the food to the person who's hungry without having to take some food away from the person who's got too much food and wastes it.
No, well,
or throws
okay.
it away.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. Well,
I agree
that's a
that if
big
you
story.
divided the stuff up, there oughtn't to be any starvation on Earth because
Not
there
only
is enough food to
starvation,
feed everybody.
But I would submit that it might be that we've come at a time where, you know, and then with the microprocessor and the Moore's law and the going, and even George Gilder, a right-winger like George Gilder, is going around saying scarcity is an absurdity. We don't have a scarcity. We only have an inefficient, incapable distribution system of this capitalistic system.
But that's
on
an
a world
apology
scale.
for
We don't have
capitalism.
it.
That's not
apology.
trying
It's
to
not
change.
inefficient. It's
You
very
don't think-
efficient
you
for
don't
what they
think
want.
capitalism with a human face is possible?
No, I think
Not
it's
at
a
all, right?
contradiction
It's a
in terms.
contradiction in
An
terms.
oxymoron.
Oxymoron, perhaps,
but
right?
the
Maybe.
scary part is
Maybe.
that while everything you're saying about the potential
Yeah.
is there, the
Yeah.
fact that there is more than enough food to feed everybody
Food
is,
and all
techno-
resources.
I know, but A, they're not giving it away to the people that need it, and B, the gap is getting worse. I mean, the scariest thing about this country, and most of the Western countries, I think, but certainly this country, is that the gap between richer and poor is increasing.
Yeah, on the surface.
Not
yeah.
decreasing.
Right.
The gap between blacks and whites
Yeah.
in terms of economics is
Yeah.
increasing,
Right.
not decreasing.
Yeah, all those
This is scary.
Right.
The gap between the life expectancy of
Yeah.
white people and black people is increasing, between rich people and poor people is
Right, right.
increasing.
That's right, on
And
the
the
surface.
fact of the matter is that despite the decades and decades, if not hundreds of years, of myth about the American middle class and we're all pretty much the same, I mean, a poor person on welfare in some inner city is not the same as Bill Gates.
No,
Just-
it's not.
They're
exactly.
just not the same.
No, it's not. It's not.
And the fact of the matter is that Bill Gates'
Yeah.
people are going to live longer
Yeah.
and eat more
No
and eat
question.
well and have everything, and the
Yeah.
other people are dying younger and
Yeah.
and starving. And if
Well,
the gap were decreasing,
Yeah.
then you could
Well,
be
the thing is, it's like
more
in
optimistic.
you know, perhaps so. Perhaps I think there's still maybe some room for optimism, because if it was as you were in a trend we were going to go into the future like that, it really would be a disastrous scenario that we would have for the human
yeah,
society.
it
and we'd
can't- it
be
couldn't go
heading
on
to
like
join
that.
entropy. So there is in evolution, there's punctuated equilibrium where there's a tremendous buildup of forces, of an inappropriate utilization of what we're capable of doing, and that story will be told at some point, and maybe there will be a liberation of the human condition.
It may
and
happen.
if there is, there must be some place where that story can be told within the media, and it's important that there be some alternative capability or places. Public access. We're on public access here.
Right.
That's part of Time Warner, this is, but there's a certain kind of organizational structure.
This is part of Time Warner.
This
You
is
don't even
Time
tell
Warner.
us that.
This is Time Warner. You're on the establishment media. This is
Oh
Time
my
Warner.
God.
But there is a division between public access, which is non-commoditized thing, and it exists around the country, and it's important, and I just wondered if maybe you think that this non-commoditized use of television, which television is the leading aspect of consciousness now, and the non-commoditized use of the internet, which we see as coming like the cavalry over the hill, there might not be some importance to be placed upon those two instances of communication in terms of maintaining a milieu where some alternative vision might be able to find its way in terms of this larger systems understanding of how the earth might be transformed. We got about 1 minute. Do you see a connection between
I think that if
public
you-
access television and the democratic aspects, and they're going to start streaming onto the internet? We got about 2 or 3 year window where the television, the leading edge of television in an alternative mode, will be public access. There should be more attention given to safeguarding public access
Oh,
as
absolutely.
an entity for
No, you have
alternative
to,
statements. That's
you
what
have
I'm
to
trying
fight
to
to
say.
stay on, because the fact is that if shows like yours and public access become a real threat to this establishment oligopoly that we're talking about, they will try to get rid of public access and everything related to it very quickly. And if you and your supporters and that whole concept are strong enough to beat back that move, then that's a major victory, because the minute you begin to look dangerous, they're certainly going to try to get rid of you.
Unless you have
No.
an alternative which is within the big tent that makes it possible, so this happy scenario where we're going to allow ourselves to do what we're capable of doing is able to present itself on a politically realistic tableau in the system. So you have to have a system where the system can be made aware of what it's capable of doing, which it doesn't do within the normal context. I don't know. Maybe that's the challenge of what both your journal and your...
I think the best tool that people would have is to be able to recognize disinformation within that big tent that they see, and they see on television or in their newspapers, and we see it every day.
Okay, well, listen, we're right out of time. Thank you, Louis Wolff, Covert Action Quarterly, and Bill Schaap. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you, Harold.
We invite
Thank
you to
you.
tune in again. We'll be coming back next week in Conversations. That's it for now. Until next week. Thanks again very much for coming in. Until next time.
Thank you.